Don't we all have a grand get-together? A good old dance, fine food and music, great company. The need for human gatherings stretches back in time. The sharing of food, dance and music, these are all a part of every culture on the planet, reaffirming social, familial and friendship bonds, and also just having a really great time together. It is a chance to be frivolous, to forget cares, to dance too much, drink too much, and eat too much. In times past, life was hard, full of drudgery. The common folk were servile to the lords and ladies of the manor, the kings, the queens, the dukes, the duchesses, and so forth. People's lives were small in scale. They had their work to do, hard work, be it in the fields or as servants in grand homes. People didn't travel as we do. Their whole lives, from birth to death, could be played out in just one very small space of the countryside or the towns. I know of older people now in the Devon countryside who have rarely been to the main cities of just that same county. So, with that in mind, and knowing that it wasn't rare to see the same sights and people every single day, it is easy to understand how the lives of common folk were full of familiar drudgery, rough with work, dirty with toil, and a constant struggle to keep food on the table and a fire in the hearth. There was no magical frivolity. Feast days were few and far between, but so welcome when they happened, such as Christmas, the end of harvest, Easter time. But in the main, life was definitely not fun. How tempting then to be invited to a party, randomly, out of the blue, by strangers full of glamour, music full of promises, the scent of rich, delicious foods, not the usual bland diet. Are you really that special to be invited to a wonderful feast, a dance, a party? The good folk, the fairy folk, oh, they do love a dance, and music, and feasting. So many folk tales tell us this. So, knowing that, what is the evidence that we should beware of joining them? Surely the Fey folk wouldn't be that wicked. Well, one thing we must always remember when we deal with the Fey is their dual nature. They aren't bad. They aren't good. They just are. The same as the flower just is, the water just is, and the breeze just is, sometimes blowing one way, sometimes blowing the other. Today, let me tell you a little about the dangers of beautiful, unusual strangers, especially ones with peculiar eyes, beguiling smiles, and fingers that are caressing, but cold to the touch, and even unusual bird song that even the most accomplished birder may not recognize, but be tempted to stop and listen to for a while. There is a tale told in the Western Isles of Ireland, set in the cold month of November, a month of darkness, ghosts, spirits and danger. A beautiful girl, said to be the prettiest in all of Ireland, was sent to the well for water, but she slipped and she fell, and when she recovered and raised her pretty eyes, she saw the strangest sight. All around her was different now, enchanted and enchanting. Not too far before her was a huge fire, with a crowd of elegant strangers watching her. She felt compelled to join them, even though fear began to fill her heart, and she knew that she should leave. But now her footsteps were not her own. They led her closer and closer against her better judgment. The most handsome young man of the party came to her and asked her for her hand in the dance. She laughed at his words because there was no music. He lifted his elegant long white fingers and made a motion to the crowd, at which the most beautiful music filled the air, and now she was lost to all. Her head filled with her only desire to dance to the entrancing music with this elegant prince forever and ever. And this they almost did, until the music stopped, at which point the stranger invited her to take supper with them. An opening appeared in the ground before her, and she was led down steps by those beautiful fingers and even more beautiful strange eyes, the whole crowd following behind. At the end of the steps was a huge hall, like nothing the poor girl had ever seen in her life, or could even have dreamed of. The tables before her were laden with foods rich, sweet, and tempting. A silver goblet was given to her, with the most jewel-like of wines. She pressed the cup to her lips, but just then the voice of a stranger behind her warned her, "Do not let a morsel of food or a drop of wine pass your lips." She placed the goblet back down on the table, much to the anger of the crowd who watched her, who now became threatening, and the innocent girl became filled with fear. A man with hair as red as fire took her hand and led her away from the hall quickly. In her fingers he pressed a branch of ground ivy, telling her to hold it tight, run back home, do not drop the branch, because this way none of the crowd could harm her. As she ran, she heard many footsteps chasing her. Closer and closer they came, until she reached her cottage. She threw open the door, slammed it shut, and hid in the bedroom. From outside came a strange cacophony of voices. "The power we had over you is gone through the magic of the herb. But wait, when you dance again to the music on the hill, you will stay with us forever, and none shall hinder." From that day the girl kept the ivy branch always close to her for safety, and never, ever, ever went near that hill again. But it was a long time before her head lost the sound of the fairy music, the Colchi. It seems that often the most beautiful, handsome, accomplished and young were the favoured victims of attempted kidnap by the fairies. After hearing the fairy music, they would have been forever touched by fairy magic, having heard music that is supposed to be forbidden to human ears. Often they would be driven half mad if they escaped, as in the case of one girl a traveller in County Clare in Ireland came across one dark night in a lowly cabin. By the hearth, where the fire blazed bright as bright can be, the girl sat, lost in a strange world of her own, chanting an impossible tune. He asked the owner why was she so afflicted, and was told that once she had heard the fairy harp, and from that day she had forgotten everything. All things were gone from her mind, even her loved ones, and all she ever heard now was that fairy music, the fairy harp, and when finally the spell broke, she would wither away and die. Unusual places also feature in tales of fairy music. Strange paths, hollow hills and fairy rings, those beautiful but dangerous rings of toadstools that grow in lush areas of the greenest grass, which are known to be the dancing places of the fairies. Woe betide anyone who dares to step within that ring, because they will be trapped by the fairy folk, dancing themselves to death or madness, dancing incessantly, insensible until they crumble away to nothing but dust. I will tell more about fairy rings and toadstools another time, but suffice to say these are dangerous portals to the fairy world, where fey music and dancing abound, and humans have very little chance of escape. There is a very peculiar tale from Ireland. In Sligo once lived a knowledgeable woman. Her grandmother's aunt once saw a fairy ball, orchestra and everything. It is said that although the fair folk have few instruments, their skill with them far surpasses any human skill, and their melodies exceed anything that we mere mortals could compose. The woman of Sligo would repeat the strange sight that her relative had seen by the lake shore. A monstrous frog played a huge fiddle. 2 little kittens played smaller fiddles. 2 cats beat drums, and 2 fat pigs played trumpets. All around this very strange orchestra the fey folk danced wildly, lit by fireflies and the moonbeams that fell upon the lake. To this very day that place is still known as a fairy glen. It is wise the witness said nothing at the sight of the fairies dancing and the strange orchestra, for it is well known that strangers who are found witnessing fairy parties and speak even one human word, they put themselves in greatest danger. Many folk coming back from a market or a fair, maybe somewhat tipsy, might hear enchanting music and lilting voices. Those with their wits still about them would silently hurry on, or lay low in the hedges until it had passed. But some, unwary, would look to find the source of the gaiety, and on finding the revellers be invited to join them. But should that human guest once utter a single word or sound, the whole scene would vanish, the traveller finding himself by the road he or she had left, covered in bruises and scratches, the fairy folk having pinched and punched them repeatedly for being so rude as to say one human word, suffering so much pain that even if the very devil himself had come along, the poor unfortunate would not have been able to pick themselves up and run. Yet these were the lucky ones. Worse has been known to happen, as we have already learned, and as is told in my next strange tale. In Carmarthenshire, in the country of Wales, there is a tale told of a young man named Sion ap Shenkin. One day he was on his way to work in the fields when he heard the most beautiful bird song, sung by the tiniest bird with brightest eyes that sat upon the branch of a tree not too far before him on the path. Enchanted by this magical music, he sat down beneath the tree, compelled to hear the last of the bird song, unable to move. Finally the little bird finished its song and Sion rose. But what strangeness he found! The tree he had been sat beneath, that was full of leaves and health and vigour, was now withered, weathered, and dead. In a strange panic, he ran to the farmhouse he had left only a few moments before. The cottage, too, was nothing like he had left it. Ivy covered the building, and in his own doorway stood a very old man, who was a complete stranger to Shonab Shengin. He shouted to the old man, asking, "What are you doing in my cottage?" The old man scoffed, saying this was his very own home. Sean asked where his father and mother were. He had left them only moments before. He stopped to listen to a beautiful strange bird song underneath the tree on the path, and yet the tree had changed while he had listened. The old man was stunned. His face grew white. He asked Sean's name. As Sean told him, the old man's face grew whiter still. He told poor Sean that he himself had been told tales by his own grandfather of how one day his brave son had left for the fields and yet never returned. Sean's heartbroken family had sought the advice of a respected wise woman named Kati Madag, and she had told them sadly that their son was captive under the spell of the fairies, and he would only be released once the last drop of sap had run dry from the sycamore tree where he was trapped beneath. The old man held open his arms to the devastated Shonab Shengin, asking for an embrace from his long-lost and now-returned relative. But before the two men could even touch, poor Shonab Shengin crumbled to dust on the doorstep. Strange bird song can be tempting fairy music, friends, a tempting trap for an innocent human out birding on a pleasant summer day. Another tale is told of this strange disparity in human and fairy time in relation to fairy parties, dancing and music in the country of Scotland at a place called Tomnahurrick. Two wandering fiddlers, Farquhar Grant and Thomas Gumming, had taken the road to Inverness in the hope of making some money for their families. Back at home the crops were poor, business was bad, absolutely nothing was profitable, but being good musicians, they at least had this skill to fall back upon. However, sadly Inverness treated them very cruelly, even though it was Christmas time, when people should have been a little kinder and a little more charitable. And they had even found a spot in a wealthy part of town. The two unfortunates played in the freezing cold and the snow until their fingers ached with effort and the sheer cold bit into their bones. Eventually, defeated and hopeless, the two travellers packed away their fiddles and took to the road once more, reaching at the bottom of the street a place called Castle Tolmy. This was a strange-looking building there, all twisting staircases and pepper-pot turrets. Sadly, this building was demolished in 1854 to make room for the bridge improvements spanning the River Ness at this point. It was here that they were approached by an old man, kindly by nature as they could see in his bright eyes. He greeted them warmly, as though he knew them already, and from where they had travelled. He asked after their homeland and was told of the poverty and sheer desperation there, to which the old man replied that that place missed the good folk now. But how about some honest work for decent pay? The fiddlers brightened. They thanked the old fellow heartily. Surely now their luck had changed. What a way the old man led them! He strode forth faster than they could have believed one of his age, and they puffed and panted to keep up with him, even though they were young men. He motioned them on. "Our guests will be impatient," he called, and he led them from the city, past the last huts, over the rough ground where not one crop or thing would grow, to the base of a hill, Tom Nahuric Hill. Here the old man sped up the hill, and to be honest, the two fiddlers were now becoming a little suspicious at this strange unworldliness. However, their feet were not their own. After all the effort of running after the old man, they were now pulled up the hill by an invisible power, and dropped halfway to the top, where not a blade of grass grew. The old man stamped his foot upon the ground. A cave opened, and he beckoned the two fiddlers to follow him into the actual hill. In wonder they did this, into a great hall full of light and beauty, tables of diamond or crystal, full of fruits, meats, and wines, things so rich the two men had no idea what they were, but rich and tempting nonetheless. The roof of the hill was a great golden dome, held by pillars covered in jewels of all colours, and before their eyes the hall began to fill with figures, small, young, all very beautiful and graceful. They wound in circles, dancing, and welcomed the two poor men. Eat, drink as much as they wished. Be merry, forget your cares. The two men were starving. They ate and drank until they could take no more. Their eyes watered with excess. And yet, as much as they ate, the table remained as full as it ever was. Finally, they were full of the best of foods and the very best of ales, and now, with their appetite sated, they were invited to a platform and invited to play. With immense joy they did just this, the crowd dancing with sheer joy to the reels and jigs, feet flying as the fiddlers played, faster and faster and faster, better than they had ever played in their lives. The fiddles seemed almost enchanted. The fiddlers were kept merry with ale, fed to them by members of the party. All their cares were forgotten, and the wild and wonderful revels continued. And now the fiddlers were having the time of their lives, and yet suddenly the old man appeared. Morning was well along, he told them. It was time for the music and dancing to end. Sadly, the musicians packed away their fiddles and followed the old fellow through the hall. They would be paid well, he told them. He would lead them to the door. They noticed that the dancers had gone from the ballroom. At the door, the old man placed a purse full of gold in the hand of each of the men, asking if they were happy with their night's work. They heaped blessing upon the old man and his people, and at that moment everything disappeared, and they found themselves on the side of the hill alone. This frightened the two men, and they crossed themselves at the sudden disappearance of the man and the door. This fear became worse as they took the path down the hill. Where once was the rough ground, There were now fields full of corn. The place of huts now had houses, grand and sturdy. At the old bridge over the Ness was now a new bridge. In the town the people were dressed in strange and unusual clothes. They asked many of these strangers what had happened, but they were met with looks as though they were insane, or worse, con men. Appalled and confused, they fled the town for their homes, but here too everything had changed. Nobody knew who they were, yet they had been known before. Buildings were new, had gone, or were changed. In despair, the two fiddlers found their way to the parish church, but it too was different. They searched the gravestones, a terrifying realization stealing over them, and there they found the proof, the gravestones of their own wives, their families, and their children passed away for more than a century. They entered the church door. The congregation turned and stared at these two strange-looking fellows. No sooner did the clergyman open the Bible and speak the first words from the good book than the people gathered watched as these two strangers crumbled to dust before their very eyes. There you have a few tales of fairy music and fairy dancing, and the dangers of accepting random invitations by beautiful or weird strangers, or even pretty little birds, no matter how tempting their music may be. There are many tales like these, and I will tell you more another time, but it is interesting to think that so many have similar themes. Fairy hills and forts, fairy rings and trees, the danger of partaking of fairy food and fairy drink, the lack of control over one's self, the difference in timescales between our world and the fairy world, the intense delight of the music and dancing, that same music bringing death or madness, the temptation put before we quite weak and easily tempted humans, and of course the crumbling to dust as we enter our own timescale, hundreds and hundreds of years after we should have met our natural end. Dear friends, the good folk can be enchanting, entrancing, beguiling, strangely attractive, but beware. As I have said before, and I will say again, they do not follow our human rules. They are as wild as the river and as beautiful, and as dangerous in equal measure, as delightful and ephemeral as a snowflake, but equally as cold and as deadly. They are fluid, wild creatures of pure nature, and we are not. We are solid, of earthy, fallible and naive to the power of nature. So please be careful around those with eyes you could fall into and invitations to the most splendid parties full of dancing and music, and beware the beguiling birdsong when you are travelling along pretty paths on a summer's day. I hope you liked this telling of tales. They were more cautionary tales, I think, this time, but then we do need to keep a little caution in mind with dealing with fairy folk, the good folk I should say, out of respect. Mine and my husband's great passions are folklore. We're both artists, we love nature and history. We literally live these things, work in these things, and our hobbies are these things. I actually think sometimes we're a little bit obsessed. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe, and please hit the little bell symbol too for notifications of the next installment. Please do tell everyone about the channel. Let's all grow a community of lovers of things fairy and folk tales. As I always say, these things help keep the channel and also our stories alive. So, until next time, dear friends, keep well, brightest of blessings, and remember, don't play with the fairy folk, or you may end up in one of my folk tales yourself.